Hey there. Today's podcast is all about preserving the history of Disney's theme parks, plus the 1939 and 1964 World's Fairs, the ideas for Epcot the city, and plenty of attractions that never came to be, with my guest, Ted Linhart of DisneyDocs.net. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 85 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. I spend a lot of my time when I'm not recording podcasts or doing everything else in life reading up on the history of the Disney parks, whether it's through biographies of various key figures, history books about certain aspects of the parks, or podcasts and blogs that dive into certain areas. But I still feel like there are things that I keep learning that astound me. I know such a small portion of what's out there, and especially when you dig into really the specifics, not the typical company history, because we all know a lot of the big stories about Walt Disney and how the parks came together and the big attractions when we've heard from people like Bob Gurr and Rolly Crump and others. But there's a lot more to it. And that's why I find it so interesting to go to Ted Linhart's website, DisneyDocs.net, because he's put together so many original source documents going back to early days of Disneyland and some of the attractions that were being put together for that, through Epcot Center and the early days of Walt Disney World, and even things that never happened, like Edison Square or the Mineral King Resort or Disney's America. There are so many failed or just jettisoned ideas that we only know maybe a small bit about, that have been lost to history or at least been replaced by a conventional narrative from the company. When you're looking at actual proposals of what they were planning to do to certain attractions that never happened, or even just ride capacity lists or attendance lists or things that might seem kind of dry, they can be really interesting to give you some context to what's happening now and even what we thought we knew about the parks. And Ted does such a good job of that. He's also a huge fan of the parks and Epcot Center and the futurism ideas connected to Epcot the city and the World's Fairs. So we dig into a lot of that and his interest in those topics, which, as you know, are very cool for me. Before we get to Ted, I did want to mention there is a way you can support the podcast, which is through Patreon by becoming an official member of the Tomorrow Society, like Jim Z, who recently joined and posted a small monthly contribution, which gets you access to some cool perks like the Tomorrow Society Bulletin monthly podcast. I just finished my October episode, which is all about Epcot Forever and what I think about that and how it connects to the history of the park. You can find out more by going to tomorrowsociety.com/member. So it was cool to talk with Ted. I'd heard him on the Retro Disney World podcast. I've reviewed his site pretty closely, but there's still a lot that I didn't know, and especially I don't know about how these documents are acquired and what goes into that. That was fascinating info for me, and I love the chance to learn more from Ted. So let's get to my conversation with Ted Linhart.
So I grew up in New York City, but every spring my parents would take me to LA because we had family there. And as part of an LA spring vacation trip was Disneyland every year. So I fondly remember going to Disneyland between 75 and 82. Maybe we were there every year during those 7 years, and never went to Disney World during that time, always Disneyland. But it was my highlight of my trip and one of the things I looked forward to every year.
I had kind of the opposite, similar era, a little bit later, but I would always go to Disney World, but same sort of thing where we would go once a year or something. And then it was, oh my gosh, we're going there again. And I think there's a lot of people that have a similar background with that. So beyond kind of those early trips, when did it become something more for you where you were really getting interested in kind of the background and history and minutia of the parks?
So there's a bit of psychology here. I'm someone who's always been frustrated when things don't work right, either traffic or a subway system or an airplane delay. And as I got older into my early teens, I mean, not much older, I started to become fascinated by cities of the future. And everything changed for me when I went to Disney World and went on Horizons, which I had no idea what it was when I walked onto it. But when I saw this vision of what the city of the future would look like, this was my utopia. This was like everything that frustrates me about living in New York or walking around or seeing something just not work, a VCR not working in my house, or a telephone call being staticky. Here was this vision of a world where everything worked flawlessly. And from that moment on, I just became obsessed with visions of the future, retrofuturism, and started to read all I could about it. Got to know the 1939 World's Fair and the 64 World's Fair. I had an older brother who was interested in this. And I was always a collector at the same time. I was collecting comic books and then first editions of fiction. But about 5 years ago, I really somehow wanted to channel this retrofuturism into something to collect because I was weaning off what I was collecting. And at the same time, Van Eaton Galleries started to have these Disney auctions. And I realized or discovered through looking at these catalogs that there was this treasure trove of materials about Walt's view of the future and Epcot and what Epcot was supposed to be, and how Disney World came to be and all the technology into Disney World. And I said, well, this is a new area of collecting. And I always like owning something on paper related to my passions. Again, comic books, first editions of James Bond novels was something of mine. So here was this perfect merge of my passion for retrofuturism and something to own on paper. Plus, I was a fan of Disney in general. And that's when it took off. And at the same time, these auctions were starting to happen. So my interest started to grow at the same time the market was being created. So it's kind of this perfect timing.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I could take this 100 different ways because you just hit on like 10 things I'm interested in. But I'll start with the auctions because I don't know much about that at all. And I find it really fascinating because now I feel like just through your site and other places that I think there's more interest in that. Even 5 years ago, I suspect that wasn't as much the case. So was there a super competitive marketplace for it, or were you able kind of to get in on the ground floor with some of these documents and other items?
I've had both. And I've also found stuff on eBay. I've had very competitive situations where I've definitely spent more than I intended. And then I've had other situations where I can't believe no one else is bidding on this item. I feel like over time, it has gotten more competitive. There was that huge auction about a year and a half ago where stuff went way too high, mostly on stuff I wasn't bidding on, but things were going 100 times over estimate. So I've had both. And there are items that come up at auctions that I will bid way too much on. And then like the next auction, the same item is there and it goes for less than half of what I paid. But I've also had the opposite, where I get the item for what I think is not too high. And then the next auction, there'll be the same item and it'll go for far more. So I probably netted out even. But I think as soon as I started getting involved in this area, it was competitive. I don't recall a time when no one was bidding. And the stuff that I like is there is a group of people who just also love this stuff. It only takes one person to bid it up. Anything Horizons, Carousel of Progress, Haunted Mansion, Submarine Voyage, there's usually someone else bidding, but sometimes not. And I find sometimes I'm surprised that I'm getting something with only a bid or two. And there's other times where I have to keep bidding. And I've definitely dropped out. Sometimes I regret it. Sometimes I don't. It really started pretty hot, I'd say, right away.
Well, that's interesting. And because I don't have a lot, like I mentioned, a lot of view into that, where I love reading documents online, but I haven't gone in and, I mean, sometimes I'll see something on eBay that I find interesting, but usually, like you said, I'll be like, oh, I'll watch that. And then the bids will just go. And for me, I mean, I'm not as aware of what the value is of a lot of things. It just goes out of control according to how I view it. Have you had a situation where there was something, I don't want to go into you overspending. That's, I don't want to talk about that, but something that you really wish you would have gotten that is kind of the white whale of something.
Not a white whale yet, but I recently purchased a submarine voyage manual, which I did spend a certain amount of money on. And looking back, there was a Haunted Mansion ride manual, very elaborately published, actually used for the Haunted Mansion, I think at Disneyland. And it was a few years ago, but, and my spending has definitely gone up as the years have gone on. And I went back and looked at what that went for. And I realized that went for like only 2/3 of what I had spent on the submarine. And I was like, why didn't I go buy that item? Why did I at that time think, oh, that was too much? And then 2 years later, it's like, it's not too much. And I regret not getting that now. So that is an item. There have been some things where I just would never spend as much as they went for. But most of those are like ride props or posters. I'm not into these posters. There were posters going for $250,000 at the big auction a few years ago that I think people like John Stamos and Drew Carey and Neil Patrick Harris were just spending ridiculous money on because they could. And I have no interest in posters at all. So I haven't had a white whale yet. Usually the white whale is probably something I do not know exists yet. A lot of the stuff I find that I really want, I don't know I want it until I see it in the catalog. There's been a Carousel of Progress brochure, this Haunted Mansion item, the submarine. The things that are really rare, I don't know I want. But nothing that I've really let go, except for this Haunted Mansion thing that I really wish I'd probably tried for.
Yeah, well, I'm so curious now about this big auction because it totally went past me when this happened, especially when you're mentioning those sums of money from obviously big Disney fans that have basically unlimited resources. So tell me a little more about this auction and how crazy it really got.
So it was an auction called That's From Disneyland, and it was one man's collection of his name was Richard Kraft, and he collected Disney stuff for decades, and it was his passion. I think his brother had passed away, and it was some sort of tribute to his brother, and he had this incredible collection. And Mike Van Eaton, who does Van Eaton Galleries, is very smart at marketing, so they created a real big event out of it. They hired the artist Shag to design the cover of the auction catalog, and it got a ton of press, just a ton of press. There are lines around the block to visit the actual viewing. And I think the estimate, I don't know, was $1 to $2 million for the whole collection. It was sold off, it wasn't one collection, one lot. It was multiple pieces, many pieces, a 2-day auction. I think it went for $7 or $8 million. And there were some pretty unique stuff in there. The Serpent from the submarine voyage was in there, some ride vehicles. But the most shocking was these posters. And there have been Disney original ride attraction posters over the years, and they go for $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. They're rare. The condition matters. But these were going for $250,000. And it seemed to be some of these major celebrities who had a lot of money, and I couldn't tell if they just wanted a piece of this auction or they knew this guy and they loved him so much and they wanted to somehow donate to I think he may have had a charity set up for some of these proceeds. And it was just crazy. I mean, this was in the middle. There's been auctions before and auctions since, and nothing was. I actually got 6 or 7 items from this auction. My stuff went for what I would consider more market value, but there were items that were just crazy. It made no sense. And it was clearly for people who had unlimited resources and weren't looking to make money someday. But there's video. If you go on YouTube, you can find a video of this auction and you can see some of these things just crazy.
Well, I think I know what I'm going to do when we finish this. I think I have about an hour to cut out for that because that really interests me. It's funny because if you just said there's some rare items that went for $250,000, I would think, okay, it's a Doom buggy, it's a Horizons ride vehicle, it's something like you mentioned, the Serpent. I could see that. Posters. I don't. That just amazes me. That's not what I would have guessed.
It's not what I would have guessed too. I was astonished at some of these prices, and for items that I know will come up again, and I couldn't understand it. I spoke to them on the phone, I think, and I'm not sure they knew exactly what was happening. But it was just this was a tribute to marketing. This was really the news coverage was much higher than I expected, and people were so interested. It became like a museum to see these items. And I think that coverage made it feel extra special, which it was a special auction, but it was not this level of crazy from my objective opinion.
Yeah, well, I'll make sure to locate a few videos and such about this and post it with the show notes. But I want to make sure we talk about your website, Disney Docs, because I've been aware of it for a while, but especially prepping for this show, I spent a lot of time going through old brochures and technical manuals, and especially I found so interesting was some of the original Walt Disney World documents that talked about what they were planning to do, or just kind of the pitches for things that never came to be, like the Move the Horizon stuff to the Carousel of Progress at Disneyland, which to me is like, I'd heard about that one other time, but still reading the document was like the initial proposal was crazy. But we'll get to some of those things eventually. I'm just curious, what made you decide you wanted to, now that you've been collecting items, you wanted to put them online on this website?
Owning these items and not sharing them to me feels counterproductive. Owning them, part of why I want to own them is I want to share them with people and maybe show them off, but have other collectors enjoy them, because it doesn't give me that much pleasure to buy them, put them away, and not display them to anyone. And I knew there were people out there interested. So I started with a Tumblr blog. It just seemed like the easiest way to share them. And it became, I don't know, had 1,000 followers, but at some point, Tumblr, I was having a technical problem. I couldn't post. Like, it kept blocking me from posting pictures. The limit. Usually, you could post 20 pictures there's some limit, but all of a sudden one day I could post one picture a day, and it told me that I was at my limit, and Tumblr wouldn't help me. So I said, I'm just going to do my own site. And I had been reading about Wix.com, which is what I use to create my own site. And it just seemed like easy to kind of own what I want to do instead of relying on Tumblr, which was also not something you can organize. So I just started to go on Wix, figure it out, had all these pictures, and did it. And people like the Retro Disney World podcast. I think Hal Bowers mentioned my site on your podcast when he was on, and started to tweet about it. I have a Twitter account because of my job that has 13,000 followers. So I started to mention it, and it just became easier to post, and people seemed to like it and appreciate it. And people started to mention me in different podcasts. But it gives me so much pleasure. I enjoy archiving things and preserving them, and I want the other enthusiasts to be able to learn more about it. There are people who read these documents, especially some of the other podcasters, who are discovering things about what I'm posting that I don't even understand that I should be discovering, because they have so much more inside knowledge. But it really gives me pleasure to buy something, own it, and then have other people enjoy it. That just enhances my collection. Without that, I don't really care as much about owning all these things.
Yeah, because in a sense, I mean, I'm sure that you're learning things about them, but when you're talking about documents that might never see the light of day, especially given, how the internet works, I mean, there are a lot of people, especially as older attractions and different things go away. I think there's a lot of people that have that interest in either something like Horizons or something much earlier like Epcot the City and such. So for you, I mean, you mentioned wanting to print it out there, and I know there's like you mentioned, the Retro Disney World guys, they have the Lake Buena Vista Historical Society. Is it important to you to also preserve the history of these parks? Is that important to, to basically, given that some of the things that, if there aren't good videos or information, have kind of gone away from older attractions?
Very important. The fact that the parks now, especially and moving forward, are becoming all based on IP, on Star Wars and Marvel, and what made Disney World and Disneyland what they were for 50 years are fading away. Some things won't fade away, but are becoming different. It is very important to me to be able to document and preserve and archive what the origins of these parks were, things that were supposed to be built that were never built, which is a passion for many people in this field. And I do love the fact that I can get some of these items and allow people to freely look at this history and keep that knowledge alive, because it seems like the passion for Disney parks is only going to keep getting bigger. It's evolving into something different. It may be Haunted Mansion, Jungle Cruise, and Pirates will always be around, but so much else, I think, in the next 10, 20 years will just become another Avengers or Frozen or Star Wars attraction, and these things that you and I and others really grew up on will become things of the past, and this is a way of kind of keeping that spirit alive, and like keeping Walt's spirit of a city of the future and a destination about how technology can improve people's lives. That's gone. I mean, I don't think there's really that exists anymore, but it's so important about what he wanted to create, and that's the part that I really want to preserve.
Yeah, definitely. And I totally agree, because I mean, while part of me thinks, you never know what can happen if there's a new leadership or such, but given just the way Disney as a company is now, it's so different. Even if there were new leaders, it's this global company with a gazillion arms going in different directions, and the parks are, they're under consumer products, so the park is a product of the company, and things that have that, like you mentioned, Haunted Mansion, Pirates, some of those attractions are their own brands now, so they're safe. But something that's not his own brand, like we've seen with things in the past that have gone away, your Horizons, World of Motion, things at the Magic Kingdom, whatnot, it's more challenging. So I agree, especially for me, what really I think is good about your site is having those source documents, because I feel like, yes, there are books out there. Some of them are official Disney books, others are unofficial, but it's easy for kind of the legend or the official company history to be out there. Whereas when you have these original documents, it's hard to argue with something that actually was a real report created in 1970 or something.
Yes, that's the stuff I really like to own, is something Disney published or had commissioned that wasn't supposed to see the light of day to the public, unless it was a brochure to get support around something like Mineral Kingdom. And that's the type of stuff that I really want to preserve. What did Card Walker or Dick Nunis or Marty Sklar plan for the parks in 1969 or 70 or 75? And how did that evolve? Seeing how a city of future, oh no, it's not. It's going to be a think tank of the future. Oh no, it's not. It's going to be an amusement park. We're going to have this hotel, or no, we're not. We're going to have this hotel. Seeing that evolution is fascinating, because of what it was all still tied to, this image of Epcot and Disney from the 50s and 60s, which was not so, it was commercial, but it wasn't so IP driven. It wasn't so tied to commercialism. It felt like everything was unique, had its own idea, and it wasn't just a retread of something else out there in pop culture, which I understand the value of that. But the spirit of what Disneyland was in 55 up to Epcot, probably in my cutoff is 89, is not there anymore. And seeing the official Disney publications about it or internal documents shows you what they're really thinking. And that's the part of owning a piece of paper that I really love, because you're touching what they thought. And that's something that is hard to replicate.
Yeah, and that's something that's a good reminder, too, in terms of Epcot, the city, because it's easy to think about, to go, okay, Walt passed away in 66, and the Epcot just immediately died. But you see these documents where initially when they're announcing Disney World and when they're getting prepped, where they are still kind of thinking, at least promoting the idea that they are going to put a city there, like you said. And granted, it might not have ever happened, but they didn't immediately go away from it. And I think it's a good reminder to kind of, like you said, the progression where it took a while. And plus then you had the gas shortage in the 70s and everything kind of stopped. But for a while, they were still trying to find a way to make it work. And I think, like you said, that there were so many people like Card Walker and like some of the early Imagineers and such that were there when Walt was there up through a certain point. But as they retired or left or whatnot, it changed. But I'm fascinated by some of those early documents about Epcot, the city, even years after, at least a few years after Walt passed. It's interesting to think about how hard they tried.
Yes, they definitely tried to keep his spirit alive. They wanted to live up to his vision, his legacy. You know, when he died, Epcot was still a very young idea and had just recently been announced. And they did try. And what would have happened had there not been a recession and gas crisis in 73? Would the Asian and Venetian hotels have been built? Would travel to Disney World have not slowed down, and we would have had a much different resort than we had today? I think we still would have gotten to where we are. But it is interesting to see that there were attempts, and they had to deal with more market conditions and their own desires to respond to them. And as people may not remember, Disney as a entertainment company in the 70s was really not that successful. Their movies weren't particularly big. They tried a lot of things that misfired. The Disney Channel hadn't really started yet. Their TV business was slowing down. So they were not the monster they are today. And that didn't give them this base of all this other income to be able to prop up the parks. And that's where we ended up through the 70s. So you can see that they tried and tried, but they couldn't. They had to deal with the world around them.
Yeah, there's an interesting alternate universe. I mean, I've Sam Genoway's book that he wrote about Progress City always interests me, where he talks about what it would have been like. But there's this alternate universe where somehow, whether Walt lived a bit longer or they, like you said, there wasn't the same financial considerations. But just from everything you've read, I'm always curious to ask people that are really into this subject about it. Could Epcot, the city, could it have worked? I mean, or was it something that was a great idea but would have changed regardless?
I think it would have changed regardless. I think it just would have been too difficult with the regulations and the actual attempt. There may have been a small attempt had Walt lived another decade to try something on a small scale, kind of like Celebration, but maybe a little bit more thoughtful and elaborate. But I think ultimately it probably would have evolved into something different than a city. Maybe not the park that we got, but I just don't think it was realistically a city was possible. If you look at the Progress City diorama that still exists today, if you go on the People Mover, the idea of that, it just seems too fanciful to believe that it would actually have happened.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the thought that Walt was able to get corporations to do, to basically because they wanted to work with him, maybe something could have existed, but it still would have been, I mean, Disneyland was a big challenge, and obviously he was very powerful and was able to do a lot, but still the amount of resources, I mean, it cost a lot for them to build Epcot, the theme park. Epcot, the city, I can't imagine how much it would have, the resources it would have taken to put that together.
Agreed. I think, and there's the issues of it, the insurance and people actually living there and dealing with an actual police force and medical and fire. And I just think it was probably too much, and it would have been to build what he actually envisioned. Yes, would have, by the time we got to, and if he had lived, we still would have had the gas shortages. That wouldn't have changed. So I think financially it just would have crumbled no matter how long he lived, even if he could have gotten people to rally around the idea from a corporate point of view.
Oh, you're talking too much sense here. This isn't good. I want to hear this, because I've had people tell me before, they're like, oh yeah, it would have worked. I'm like, really? That's great. I love it. But no, I understand what you're saying here, because there's just a lot of steps, much more than a theme park. But let's talk about Epcot Center, because I know you mentioned being really into Horizons and how much that had an impact on you. I mean, that's still probably my favorite attraction. I list it as my favorite attraction because I feel like it embodies everything that I loved about Epcot Center and the park at the time. But you know what I'm finding really interesting lately, and I don't know if it's just because Disney is now talking so much about their transformation of Epcot and all of that, but there just seems to be a renewed interest in the original Epcot Center. And I wonder too if it's a lot of people that never went that now are looking at it kind of like how I look at the 1964 World's Fair, like, wow, that would have been the most amazing thing. But what for you? Why do you think there's such an interest now in that original Epcot Center among so many fans?
I think because it was envisioning the future when things didn't seem to be changing so fast. I think for many of us who were growing up in that era, the early 80s, it was a time where you could look ahead 10, 15 years or 20 years, 30 years, and that could stay with you for a decade. Things didn't change so much between 83 when Horizons opened and mid-90s when it was starting to kind of close up, even though it didn't close up till 99. There was an era that was captured there that felt like the future was still far away, and even though technology was changing, it wasn't changing at the leaps and bounds it's changing today. And there was a freshness to it. There was a newness to it. There was a spirit that was captured of technology and how the future could be better through technology. And it was all very pristine. And it was this new invention where all other forms of entertainment were still pretty basic. You had a VCR that didn't look great. Movies, technology, and special effects were advanced. Star Wars had obviously happened. But there wasn't so much ability to get so much entertainment all the time anywhere. And this was really a destination. And it was pristine. And it had the spirit of so much of Disney in it. And that's gone now. Future World is a shell of itself. And so much else in there just feels a little bit old. And now it's being replaced with IP. So I think there's this nostalgia for this past era when it was looking into the future, felt futuristic, and now it feels like you could never do that again. You can never build something that looks at the future because a year later it's going to feel out of date. And I think people kind of miss that time when you could look ahead 10, 15 years and realize that that was still something to aspire to and it wasn't going to get eradicated 2 years later.
Yeah, and that's, you kind of answered my next question, because there's always the thought whenever you kind of do this, well, what if I was in charge of Disney, or if I was, what would I do? And there's always the thought of, people always say, well, Horizons could never work today. And in one sense, that's true, because the exact attraction, if you just drop that into Epcot, yes, I mean, setting aside the nostalgia, we're thinking about we were all brainwashed and we didn't know it was there before. I don't think it would totally work. But the question is more, okay, yes, that wouldn't work the way it was designed, but could something in that spirit work? And I think that's the trick, where I feel like there's still a way, there are still little elements of kind of the spirit of it that still exists, whether it's in part of Spaceship Earth or in the Land Pavilion or looking at the aquarium and the seas. I mean, you gotta look. Some of the World Showcase films, there's something there. But am I even being too optimistic? And is there a way, given the way our culture is now with the internet and smartphones and everything else, for something like this to even work in a theme park? Is that possible?
So first of all, I'm going to disagree with you. I think if Horizons was there today, it would work. If you watch a ride video, most of what they show is still futuristic. Some of the technology feels like we've surpassed it, but we're not living on space stations. We don't have land speeders to go work in the desert. We're not holographically talking to people. We have Skype and we have phones, but I actually think that ride itself, unlike Carousel of Progress, still has a vision of the future we haven't achieved. So I'm going to challenge that notion. However, I do think that the people who run Disney parks could say, we're going to redo Horizons, we're going to update it, we're going to find a way to make it look futuristic and have it last another decade or 2 decades. Be thoughtful that it's not stuff that's so off in the distance, because that was the point of Horizons, is that all this could be possible over time. I absolutely think that could be both. Why not? Why can't we have a vision of the future today that feels futuristic but achievable and won't disappear in 2 years? That's what I was pointing out, I think, is why we have that nostalgia for the old Epcot, because that's what it did. I think if you thought about it now and tried it, you could do it. Spaceship Earth still attracts people, and that feels, it is looking back at the past, but it tries to talk about the future a little bit. Carousel of Progress is still going. Hopefully it won't fade away. And it does talk about the past, but has a vision of the future that I hope they'll update. So absolutely, I think people would be very open and interested in something that depicts life in the future, especially optimistically. I think that's what makes all of Epcot, another reason Epcot nostalgia, I think, is so hot now, and why Horizons has so much passion, is most of the views of the future we get in entertainment is dystopian. Everything that's successful in science fiction, from Walking Dead, Watchmen's coming on HBO, most successful views of the future in pop culture are dystopian. Something is terrible, the world has ended, and how are we going to survive? I think people are very hungry for something that looks at life in the future that's positive. And I think if Disney created a ride that did that, there would be a lot of hunger for it, especially how talented the Imagineers are. It just seems silly to suggest they can't do it.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And don't get me wrong. If they came out tomorrow and said, we're putting Horizons in, I would be like the most happiest person in the world. So I'm probably being too pragmatic. I'm just trying to think of it in terms of technology. But that's the thing too, though, where I think that attraction, I read some of the documents on your site. GE was so invested in that. And I almost feel like it's amazing to read that and to learn like just how close they were in a lot of it. And I don't want to lose your point here, but basically it's too bad, because if GE had decided we're going to renew our contract for 10 more years or something in 93, and they had decided we're going to do an update to it. And we're going to I'm not talking major update. Like you said, we don't really need to update the concepts, but whatever it is, some new effects, you spruce it up a little bit, whatever you need to do there, it probably would have survived for good. I mean, who knows?
I agree.
I think it would have made it, because there was that line in the mid-90s when World of Motion closed, where Imagination closed, where all these things closed. If somehow you could get over that line, I feel like you get to the mid-2000s, Disney, like you see with Imagination now, doesn't really want to mess with replacing anything anyway. So it's just unfortunate that it didn't get over that hump. And, they were going to build another version, I believe, in Westcott. And then, like I mentioned earlier, they thought about putting some of Horizons into the Carousel of Progress. It could have survived. It's just too bad that it closed at just the wrong time, I feel like.
Yes, I think if some other things had lined up, I think the building was also a little bit unsound. And I think that if other things had been just a little bit different, it could have survived and evolved like Carousel Progress has, and we could have it today. I think the technology is probably there to create something interesting. I have a feeling that these days people are looking for more of an immersive ride, like Flight of Passage, and maybe the idea of just riding through something that isn't iconic like Haunted Mansion, just looking at the future. Maybe people are past that, but I do think there was an opportunity to save it, move it, redo it. I guess I don't give up hope that someday it'll happen, because I think Disney knows the passion for this ride. They know it. When you go to D23 Rewind, which I went to a few years ago, they showed all the end rides, all the ways, the 3 ways home. So they know it. Maybe they just don't think it's commercially viable, or that people will flock to it and take up the space. They don't want to take up the space that they would need to do it.
And that's the interesting thing I wanted to ask you about, because, I followed the recent D23 very closely, and they did have the big Epcot exhibit with all the old attraction posters, and even the way that they presented new changes. Like a few years ago, they closed Energy, they closed a great movie ride, and they seemed very kind of callous about it. They were just like, here's what we're doing it, we're moving to the future. There wasn't a lot of they didn't really focus much on the vintage side of it, on the fans. This year, I feel like they looked at it and they went, they've studied more online, or I don't know. They were very focused. And then they have this show now, Epcot Forever, the temporary nighttime show, which has multiple examples of Horizon's music in it. It's a pretty big part of it. And other old music. I mean, they've got Kitchen Cabaret and all kinds of clips where I'm like, really? That's in a nighttime show at a Disney park? So again, it's one thing to have a temporary nighttime show and an exhibit, and another thing to do a whole new attraction. To me, things like this do give me a little hope that maybe, whether it's when they update the final scene of Carousel of Progress, like you mentioned, or when they make other smaller changes, that maybe they could do something different. Am I being too optimistic?
A little optimistic, not too optimistic. I think there's a chance of it. I do agree they seem to be embracing their retroness a little more. I think there's a big gap between that and actually spending the $100 million it takes to build a new Horizons. But the fact that they are looking back at their roots gives me hope that not everything will be an IP-based attraction moving forward.
It's interesting that I feel like the IP question is coming up more than ever. And part of it is Disney's own doing, because you have people like Bob Chapek or Bob Iger that just give quotes that are kind of painful to hear about everything has to have an IP and et cetera. And this is the case. I mean, you think about it, Expedition Everest only opened like 12 years ago or something. So it's not like they've been doing this forever. Soarin' opened in Florida, similar time frame. So there are things they do that are not IP based, but it does seem to be that's the focus. However, they just released, and I know we're getting way off where we started, but they had Galaxy's Edge open. Big IP, not a big hit. So it makes me think they're not going to change their approach, but it does kind of raise questions on how successful you can be with just going all branding with it.
Agreed. I do want some of these things to stumble because I do want them to realize that there's other things out there to build.
So I wanted to make sure I ask you about this because we've already talked several times about Carousel of Progress, and I noticed you have the 1958 Edison Square proposal, which eventually morphed into Carousel of Progress, which I find so fascinating. So I would love to hear from you a little bit about that and why that's sort of an interesting thing to you.
Edison Square, which was a proposal to build a look at how GE and its ability to create light and its history over the creation of the company through modern day electricity, supposed to be kind of a walkthrough of the history of the company and electricity. It really represents what Walt wanted his parks to become and Epcot to become, which was looking at the past of technology, tracing its roots to the current day, and then looking at the future. This was just kind of a beginning of what became Carousel of Progress and in a way became Horizon since GE sponsored it. And the proposal itself has that Disney feel where it really has lots of great images in it. It tries to represent what the ride would be on paper. It goes through the history of what GE is and step by step what the ride would be. And it's such a precursor to a lot of what Epcot would become, a lot of what the vision for the 60s and 70s and 80s of Disney theme parks. The fact it's a rare document to find and it's kind of hard to really remember that this was a proposal. It's just a great piece to own. It's really got lots of great images in it, and it has you can see some of the early elements of Carousel of Progress in there. Uncle Orville in the bathtub. So it's just it shows how the company was approaching the idea of proposing different attractions and how they thought about things and how they communicated their ideas. And you can see a lot of elements of what really became 20 years later with Epcot in this document. And that's part of what I really love to collect is these early graphic and text proposals for rides, which were meant both for internal selling through, for sponsors to buy, and eventually for the press if they're going to get on board. So they had multiple purposes to print these documents. And it's great just to be able to share that imagery and that history because it represents a lot of the evolution of Disney parks. And that's what my site is supposed to do, is try to document and archive all this history.
Yeah, definitely. And I looked at it for a while, but I feel like I still want to look back and read even closer that proposal, because what surprised me, like you mentioned, is, this is 1958. And I know Carousel Progress as its original form was in the World's Fair in 64, but still to see that and have it say like scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, and granted, it's not the same exact format at all, but just the way that they go through it and have it as an extension to Main Street. To me, that's really interesting that they already were kind of thinking that way, but it wasn't like now you have Carousel of Progress in Tomorrowland, which granted, well, all of it now is the past, but originally 3/4 of it was kind of considered the past, and then we had a bit of the future where, well, more with the Progress City originally. But it interests me to see something from that far back that is so detailed and to me is written like I might expect a modern proposal to be written, with how much information and the way it's put together. And like you said, I love the connections. I love old connections to Horizons, but just to that type of thinking and that type of attraction is just brilliant.
And you can see just how smart they were at putting their thoughts on paper, because these things required obviously money to build, and you needed to get buy-in from either the CEO of the company or someone you were trying to get to sponsor, like GE. And they really had this amazing ability to allow you to envision what any ride would be. And I have multiple versions of documents like this for other rides. They were just so masterful at allowing you to just read a document and envision what the ride would be. That was just what made the Imagineers, I think, so special outside of, before they actually created the ride itself, is that they could allow you to envision what it would be, and the way they talked about it and the way they broke down, how long it would take to put guests through it, what's the capacity, the way they thought about it. And it comes across in a way that anyone can read it. You don't have to be a technical expert to understand what it was. And it had that remarkable balance of both enough information to clearly indicate thoughtfulness, but also the ability for anyone to read it and quickly understand what it was. The fact that it never came to be is it just evolved, and obviously GE stuck with them over time for other things. It's just a great example of what Imagineers created. And now it may seem like something, well, that's just part of business. But at this day and age, I think it was really unique to what made the Disney park so successful, is this sort of talent and communication.
Well, yeah, you think about it too. Disneyland had only been open for 3 years, and not all of the early Disneyland attractions were on this scale. I mean, even the dark rides, we think about the Fantasyland dark rides, those are in Disneyland were redone for the Fantasyland update in the 80s. So a lot of the early Disneyland attractions were not on this. And you look at this and the way it's presented, and it reminds me of, I wouldn't maybe not say today, but like things for Epcot Center and the way they do storytelling, where it's very progression. There's a progression to it. And for that level, I mean, it almost seems like they were inventing this style of attraction at the time with ideas like this.
Yes, this was something that no one else had done yet. I mean, they created the modern theme park, and it does show how advanced they were in just 3 years to put this together, to think about it, to get a sponsor essentially on board, to come up with a name, to envision where it would go in the park, to think ahead, and to use this idea of the past, the present, the future as kind of their form of establishing what an attraction would be that became so successful for them. It just shows how they got their act together so quickly. From that day in 55 when the cement wasn't quite dry yet and everything looked like it was going to be a disaster, to here they are thinking about all sorts of different attractions that can bring people in and allow a sponsor to participate in a very organic way. That just shows a lot of creative thinking, and it really shows why we are where we are today, with these parks just being such a part of everyone's life and history and childhood. That's what thrills me about owning documents like this, because document ties directly to all that construction. Without these documents, none of what exists today would exist. It had to be on paper first.
Totally. It's one of those great archival or source documents that still connects to today and really it helps you to understand better how things evolved, which I really appreciate. I wanted to ask you about, you have multiple documents about the Mineral King project, which I know is something that a lot of Disney fans are interested in. You have a brochure about it. You also have a Forest Service report about it, which I think is very interesting and I need to dig into more. What interests you about this project that unfortunately never came to pass?
I think the fact that it was not going to be a Disney park attraction, it's like going to be another attraction somewhere else, so not even attraction, a resort area. The fact that it created so much controversy and that actually it was killed because of its theoretical environmental disruption to the area. The fact that I don't know that Disney had yet experienced getting basically shut down on a project. The fact that so many different materials were written about it and the way they talk about it, the way they had to sell it, seemed like they were ready to go. And just the idea of what wasn't, what could have been, is almost sometimes more exciting than what is. And this is pretty much that first big outside Disneyland. Let's try to expand our footprint and do, a skiing resort, which wasn't necessarily a natural progression, but the fact that they had to fight for it and they lost is just fascinating. And that there are paper materials. It wasn't just an idea that they tried and people said no and they stopped. They actually were printing up documents and selling it to the public and proposing it. And I don't know that they expected to be so shut down by forces against them.
That's the thing, because now we can look and say one other big project that didn't make it, which was Disney's America, which we can talk about in a moment, which does not have the same, I think. It's different because it's more recent. It's Eisner. It's not Walt Disney. And then after that. But it seemed like there was a stretch where everything was clicking, the World's Fair at Disneyland. And obviously Mineral King went well into the 70s, but it still was an idea. There was this idea. And when you hear about how close they got, I mean, this was not just some project that's like, you hear about some of those resorts that never showed up. They were pretty far along in this. I mean, before it ended up, unfortunately, not coming to be.
And I thought they really thought they would win this battle. They tried to show why it was good for the area, why it wasn't an environmental issue. And you could see them trying to rally around their talking points. So it's, they knew they had a problem. I don't know exactly when, and they tried to communicate that, and maybe they thought they'd get the public on their side, but they never got there. And it is one of those just failed initiatives that maybe it was for the best. Maybe it was never meant to be, and today maybe it would even have lasted had they opened it. So they were able to kind of refocus their efforts. I'm not sure it was such a good idea. Also, if it had been in the 70s, again, with the economic crises, it may have been a real drain on the company. So in a way, maybe they were lucky not to have made a go at it.
Yeah, I mean, you see what happened when Disneyland Paris had so many issues. There are so many. I mean, that killed, it's never direct, but that may have killed Westcott. That may have killed a lot of really neat things. So who knows if this had really, I mean, this is total made up on the spot thing, but it could have impacted Epcot if it had done poorly.
True. It's definitely possible. If it was a drag, they may have said, we're just going to be happy with Disneyland and not try to, and Disney World, and that's it for us. But we'll never know.
Yeah. And so the other thing too is, like I mentioned, Disney's America, which part of what interests me about this project is that it's not like there's there's so much information out there about it. I mean, I know you can find it if you're really good at research and going to libraries. You have a brochure and a newsletter on there about it. And it's still, to me, one of the stranger projects I've ever seen. And I'm like, they have things in here like you can have a Circle Vision film where you're inside a Civil War battle. There's a ballpark. You can somehow simulate combat with tanks. There's all the possible historical minefield where basically you could run into a lot of issues. So I don't know if this interests you as much, but I still find it interesting you have it on the site because it's something that people find really interesting, the fact that Eisner at kind of the height of his power couldn't make this happen.
It is interesting. It's probably the latest item of interest to me because I remember it when it happened. Most of the things I really like, again, cut off about 89, but this does fascinate me because it was their probably last failed attempt to create something, and it did encounter all these problems. And even in the brochure I have, they try to get ahead of it. They talk about environmental sensitivity, like that's a section of this document where they try to foresee all the reasons people will ask them not to do it, and they try to come up with talking points to combat that. It is, again, probably the second example, only the second example of when market forces corralled successfully to counter Disney. It's also probably it's not a coincidence that it's again not a Disney theme park. It wasn't part of any of the original or extended Disneyland or Disney World. It was trying to do something different. And it seems like when Disney tries to go out of its comfort zone, it doesn't work. They seem to have ideas that somehow run into problem with other people's goals and agendas, perhaps rightfully so. So it does seem like they have limits. They can't do everything. They can't just create everything. And maybe at the time, the sensitivity to talking about Civil War or slavery as a ride and attraction, somehow maybe it was still a little bit stuck in the early 80s and 70s where doing those things didn't seem as bad, but they just got caught up in an era where using these things as kind of entertainment caught up with them.
Yeah, I think so, because I think now, too, it wouldn't go well.
No, it'd be worse now. It'd be worse now. They would see, at the time, I think some people just accepted it. Now I think nobody would. They would be a much bigger firestorm than even then. And it was pretty, I remember that time. I remember pretty quickly the tides turning against them at the time when they announced.
Yeah, it's one thing to do, and I mean, Hall of Presidents, has been enough about that.
Yes.
And American Adventure, which I feel like is pretty safe. It's not, but still, even those are there. But if you tried to do a new, I'm talking ground up, new historical attraction, it might be a different story.
I agree. Yes. I think they found their comfort zone. No one's going to say, don't do a Guardians of the Galaxy roller coaster. That's not going to be something that, well, fair enough. I will too, but there won't be such a cultural sensitivity issue. There may be people who just find it boring or not retro enough, but it seems like they have learned to kind of stay in their lane and not try to do these things that aren't part of their core competencies.
Agreed. All right. Well, I want to ask you about one more kind of big topic before we finish, and we haven't really mentioned it at all, and that's the World Fairs.
Yes.
Because I know you have a lot of information about the World's Fair, and I'm fairly familiar with the 64 World's Fair, just because, there's whole episodes of the Disneyland TV series, and there's books about it, and there's documentaries about it. There's a lot. But the 3940 World's Fair is a big blind spot for me, and you have a lot of information about that, including things like, which fascinates me, which is that Futurama exhibit, which is like this massive model of the city of tomorrow and all that. I mean, this has to be right up your alley. So what really excites you about just the 39 World's Fair, and what interests you?
It is the origins of all this retrofuturism. It's before World War II was starting. It's after the Depression. It's when people like Norman Bell Geddes were designing using streamlined Art Deco modeling to envision what the world of the future would look like. And people were still optimistic about the future. And here was this World's Fair that was galvanizing all of these views of technology. And we were at this precipice of TV was just starting. TV was introduced at the World's Fair. So it really is the origins of Epcot. As far as I know, not sure that Walt attended the 39 World's Fair. Maybe he did, and I just missed that. And he clearly didn't design anything for it. But it really is the origins of everything. Everything Epcot, everything 64 World's Fair was, of course, based on the 39. It's the same location. And there's so many elements of what we see today in Disney, or what we saw in the 80s in Disney parks, that are there. From the Futurama ride is one of them, definitely. And if you look at the way the buildings were designed, these streamlined buildings, and I have a camera from the World's Fair. Everything had these streamlined elements that are so embodiment of retrofuturism, which is what Walt viewed, even if he didn't call it that, and what became 64 World's Fair, what Disneyland and Tomorrowland was about, what Epcot was about, what Future World was about. So all of it has its origins in the 39th World. If it wasn't for the 39th World Fair, they never have been a 64 World's Fair, so there wouldn't have been It's a Small World, it wouldn't have been Carousel of Progress or Mr. Lincoln. Who knows what Disneyland would have been without the 39th World's Fair. He still may have thought of it, but I think that set a lot in motion. And it was, very, very widely visited as well.
Wow. Well, yeah. I mean, I have that page bookmarked because I want to dig a lot further into some of the brochures of the various pavilions and, postcards and everything you have on there, because I love the idea of these kind of touch points, whether it's the 39 World's Fair and 64, Disneyland opening, Epcot opening, that kind of have led down a certain path. Now, where that's going to lead in the future, who knows? But there's still a lot of interesting points along the way, and I think your site does a really good job of having more than just collecting documents, because that's the process, but I think the way that it kind of connects all the history together is really cool. So I highly recommend checking it out. Just make sure that you set aside a lot of time. That's what I will say.
I have a lot of 39 stuff I have not posted yet, so that's on my agenda to do this fall.
Well, great. I'm excited about that too. So Ted, this has been awesome to talk with you. I'm sure that we have interested some listeners to dig further into your site. So if people want to connect with you either on Twitter or just to find your site, where's kind of the good places to go?
So DisneyDocs.net is my site. On Twitter at Ted on TV, which is part of my day job working at NBC Universal. And on Disney Docs, I have a section on how you can email me if you have any questions, or you can also sign up for my periodic email newsletters with updates on the site. So those are all good places to go.
Well, awesome. Well, Ted, this was a blast to do, and thanks so much for being on the podcast.
And thank you, Dan. I will be listening to all of your podcast episodes in the future.
Awesome. That's what I want to hear. Good work. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, I would definitely suggest you check out my conversations with Hal Bowers and Brian P. Miles of the Retro Disney World podcast, where we cover a lot of similar topics about our look back at Epcot Center and other early aspects of the parks. You can find both at tomorrowsociety.com. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc and Facebook or Instagram at tomorrowsociety. You can email me at dan@tomorrowsociety.com if you'd like to get a hold of me. And of course, don't forget, if you want to learn more about supporting the show, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com/member. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Thank you so much for listening and for all the great support for the podcast. I have a lot of really cool shows coming up in November and beyond. And I'm just loving the chance to get to talk to so many interesting people about what I love, theme parks, their history, and what's currently happening today. And I'll talk to you again next time.